If you want to know where the next $1 trillion in the AI sector is going, you really need to stop looking at the software.
Yeah, the front end stuff is just, it's a distraction at this point.
Right, like stop looking at the shiny new chat interfaces, the video generators, the consumer apps. Because right now, behind the scenes, the entire global AI revolution is slamming into a literal physical brick wall.
A massive brick wall.
And so, welcome to today's deep dive, where we are looking at a fascinating stack of translated investor notes and analyst research. And this stack actually maps out the hidden roadmap for breaking through that wall.
The premise we're unpacking today, I mean, it fundamentally changes how you look at technological progress.
How so?
Well, we tend to imagine innovation as this, smooth, continuous curve, just going up and to the right. But the thesis laid out in these notes argues that at the hardware level, progress it's anything but smooth.
It's a lot messier.
Exactly. It is a violent stop and start sequence. You slam into a constraint, you engineer a desperate breakthrough, and then you just sprint at full speed until the system chokes on the next limitation.
Which brings us to the mission for this deep dive. For you listening, we are exploring a highly specific, highly predictable cycle hidden in the physical infrastructure of artificial intelligence.
Right.
And according to the analyst who authored these translated notes, we're currently perched right on the edge of the third major shift in this sequence.
And we should clarify, this isn't theoretical. We are talking about the actual plumbing of the AI data centers that are being built, like, right now in 2026.
Yeah, real money, real concrete.
Yeah.
But to understand the weight of these claims, we really need to look at the track record the author establishes in the opening pages of our sources.
Because they're making some massive structural predictions here.
Huge. And they back them up by pointing to their historical success in playing this exact type of bottleneck sequence.
Right. The notes mention they caught the tail end of the memory sector's massive rise. They explicitly call out their timing on names like SNDK, Samsung, SK Hynix, and MU.
But the part that really jumps off the page for me is their claim of front-running institutional investors in early photonics. Like they list companies like AAR, AXTI, Leti, and COHR.
Yeah, they essentially got in before the massive wave of institutional capital completely rewrote the landscape.
Which is the dream, right?
It is, but front-running the institutions requires understanding a very specific mechanic of technology markets. Capital naturally and aggressively flows to the point of most resistance.
The choke point.
Exactly. If you can identify the choke point in a multi-trillion-dollar supply chain, you can identify exactly where the entire industry's R&D budget is about to be deployed.
So the author's thesis hinges on the idea that technology, especially at this scale, global AI infrastructure, it only evolves to solve whatever is currently choking the system.
That's the engine of the whole cycle.
Okay, let me try to map out the specific timeline these notes give us, because the analyst breaks this down into a very rigid sequence.
They do.
According to their research, compute, specifically GPUs, was the primary bottleneck in 2023. Then, in 2024, the choke point shifted to memory.
Specifically high bandwidth memory, or HBM.
Right. And now for 2025 and beyond, the ultimate bottleneck is interconnect and networking.
That sequence compute, then memory, then interconnects. I mean, that is the backbone of the entire argument here.
I was trying to visualize this progression earlier, and the best way I can picture it is by imagining we're trying to build a massive, sprawling AI supercity from scratch.
Okay, I like that.
Back in 2023, the absolute priority was just, getting the buildings up. We needed skyscrapers to process everything.
Yeah.
Those skyscrapers are the GPUs, the compute power.
Right. You pour all your capital into construction because if you don't have the buildings...
You don't have a city.
A fitting analogy. The initial CapEx was entirely focused on raw processing capability.
But then, 2024 rolls around, you have all these amazing skyscrapers full of incredibly fast workers, but you suddenly realize you have nowhere to actually store the millions of documents those workers are generating.
That the processing power is there, but the short-term recall is failing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The workers are just standing around holding stacks of paper, so the new bottleneck becomes storage. The industry had to rush to build these giant, incredibly fast filing cabinets right next to the workers.
That was the memory phase, the HBM phase.
Right. You solved that problem. But now, sitting here in 2026, the skyscrapers are fully operational, the filing cabinets are installed, and the entire city has just ground to a complete halt.
Because of the traffic.
Total gridlock. The streets between the buildings are completely jammed. The workers can't pass a single document from one skyscraper to another without sitting in miles of traffic.
And taking that analogy back to the physical hardware, those idle workers in the gridlock skyscrapers represent incredibly expensive, multi-million-dollar GPU clusters.
Just sitting there doing nothing.
Literally just waiting. When data cannot move fast enough between the individual chips, your cutting-edge processors are stalled, and the economics of that are disastrous for a data center.
So they have to fix it.
They have no choice. So the entire logic of the investment supercycle shifts violently. The only step that matters right now is building high-speed rail lines between the buildings to clear that gridlock.
Which brings us to a direct translating quote from the analyst note in our stack today. It reads, "We judge that the third investment cycle of the AI value chain has officially begun."
Following the GPUs in 2023 and the memory in 2024.
Yeah. And the author predicts that post-2025, optical interconnects will become the fastest growing core segment.
Notice the phrasing there. Fastest growing core segment. The analyst is basically arguing that the growth in interconnects will mathematically outpace the growth of the GPUs and the memory that came before it.
Just because it's the current barrier to scale.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because when the sources talk about, optical interconnects, it's very easy to picture a technician in a data center just like plugging in a shinier, slightly better fiber optic cable into the back of a server rack.
Right, just upgrading the Ethernet cord.
Yeah. But looking at the incredibly dense alphabet soup of acronyms in these notes, it seems like the author is outlining a fundamental shift in physics.
They absolutely are.
The notes highlight 3 key technologies moving from the lab to commercial mass production. CPO, SiPh, and ELS.
So those acronyms represent co-packaged optics, silicon photonics, and external laser sources. And you're hitting on the exact physical limitation that drove this entire shift.
We're not just talking about better cables.
And not at all. We are talking about fundamentally altering the architecture of how chips physically communicate.
I need to play devil's advocate here for a second. For decades, we've used copper to move data, right? Copper wires, copper traces on circuit boards. Why can't we just use thicker copper? Like, why do we have to completely reinvent the wheel and shift to lasers and light?
Well, the problem with copper is just a matter of basic physics at extreme speeds. As you push more data faster through a copper wire, you run into severe signal degradation and impedance.
So the signal gets lost.
Yeah, the electrical signal literally starts to lose its integrity over very short distances. To fight that, you have to pump massive amounts of power through the copper to force the signal to the other side.
And more power means more heat.
Immense heat. At the transfer speeds AI data centers are targeting now, pushing electrical signals through copper over any meaningful distance either requires so much power that it melts the budget, or the signal just arrives as garbled noise.
Wow.
Yeah, copper has reached its physical limit for this specific application, so the industry is forced to transition from electrons moving through metal to photons actual light moving through glass.
Moving to light, I mean, that sounds incredibly futuristic, but also incredibly complicated to integrate into a standard silicon computer chip.
It is a massive engineering hurdle. Historically, a motherboard would have the main processor chip in one place and then an entirely separate component and an optical transceiver somewhere else on the board.
Right.
The electrical signal had to travel across the board to the transceiver, get translated into light, and then shoot out through a fiber cable.
Wait, that still means you're using copper to get from the chip to the transceiver. Right, so you run into the exact same power and heat issues.
Exactly the problem. And that is what co-packaged optics, or CPO, is designed to solve.
Okay.
Instead of having a separate transceiver across the board, CPO physically moves the optical connection directly onto the processor's packaging itself. The silicon processing and the photonics are merged into a single, tightly integrated unit.
Wait, I have to stop you there.
Yeah.
Because the notes mention ELS external laser sources. If we are packing everything tightly together onto the processor, why do we need an external laser? Don't lasers generate heat? And aren't these AI processors already running so hot they basically need liquid cooling?
That is the multi-billion-dollar engineering dilemma you just identified.
Yeah.
You are absolutely right. Lasers are incredibly sensitive to heat.
Right.
If a laser gets too hot, its wavelength drifts, the light distorts, and your data gets corrupted. Meanwhile, the GPU it's sitting next to is practically boiling. You cannot put a delicate laser directly next to an AI chip running at maximum capacity.
So the co-packaged optics concept has a fatal flaw.
It would, without ELS. external laser sources solve the thermal nightmare.
see.
Yeah, instead of putting the laser on the chip, the engineers physically separate the light source.
Yeah.
The laser sits safely away from the heat of the processor, generating a steady, pure beam of light.
Oh, no.
That raw light is then piped into the chip package via fiber.
Okay, so the pure light arrives at the chip. But how does the data actually get onto the light beam if the laser isn't there to pulse it?
That is where the third piece of the puzzle comes in, SiPh, or silicon photonics. Once that raw light enters the chip package, the silicon photonics act as a microscopic, incredibly fast shutter. It modulates the light, blinking it on and off billions of times a second, encoding the processor's electrical data onto the light beam before sending it out to the rest of the data center.
That is staggering.
Yeah.
So the ELS provides the blank canvas of light from a safe distance. The silicon photonics on the chip paint the data onto that light, and the entire architecture is wrapped up in co-packaged optics to completely eliminate the copper bottleneck.
You've got it.
The high-speed rail line now runs straight to the desk of the worker inside the skyscraper.
The engineering is breathtaking, and according to the analyst's thesis, the industry is rapidly approaching a moment where this technology leaves the experimental phase and enters mass commercialization.
Yeah, the notes point specifically to something called the 1.6T standardization and massive scale-up optical transitions.
Right.
When you see standardization in a research note like this, what is the actual implication for the market? Like, is that just an engineering milestone?
No, it is the starting gun for the supply chain. When the entire industry agrees on a standard, in this case, 1.6T, which refers to a staggering 1.6 terabits per second data transfer rate, it means the major players have stopped arguing over the design.
They've agreed on the gauge of the train tracks.
Precisely. Once the standard is set, it gives manufacturers the green light to pour billions of dollars into scaling up mass production without the fear that the technology will, suddenly change tomorrow.
Which seamlessly transitions us from the theoretical physics to the actionable strategy outlined in our sources. Because knowing how silicon photonics works is fascinating, but the author of these notes is outlining exactly how they are positioning themselves financially to capitalize on this shift.
And the timeline they present is arguably the most critical piece of the puzzle here.
Yeah, the notes state that the major structural inflection point where CPO commercialization and the 1.6T standardization all perfectly align hits specifically between 2027 and 2028.
That 2027 to 2028 window is framed as the bullseye. It's the moment the analyst believes this technology becomes the inescapable dominant reality of every new AI data center.
But right now, we are sitting in 2026. So the entire strategy the author proposes is to front-run this cycle immediately.
Exactly.
To position capital before that 2027 inflection point arrives, and the broader market completely wakes up to the bottleneck resolution.
And the notes break this front-running strategy down into two very distinct paths. The author categorizes them as the safe play and the ideal play.
Let's examine the safe play first. The notes point to larger players who already have captive technology. The tickers they explicitly list for this route are MRVL, AVGO, TSM, and NOK.
Right, these are the established titans of the semiconductor and networking space. When the author describes their technology as captive, it means these massive corporations already have a significant amount of optical and networking capability housed internally.
They own it.
Yeah. They have the resources, they have the patents, and they are absolutely going to be major beneficiaries as the industry upgrades its networking infrastructure.
But because they are massive diversified ships, a rising tide lifts them, but they aren't going to quadruple in size overnight just because one component in their vast portfolio takes off.
No, they're heavily insulated by their other business lines. That insulation makes them the safe play, but it also dilutes the pure upside if you are specifically trying to capture the explosive growth of this architectural shift to co-packaged optics.
Which naturally leads us to the author's preferred approach, what they label the ideal play.
Right.
The thesis states that getting direct, concentrated exposure to the next supercycle is ideal, and the analyst is executing this by heavily targeting the specific supply chain components required to make CPO, ELS, and SiPh a reality.
And the list of names changes drastically here.
Completely. They highlight testing with AEHR, ELS with SiPh, packaging with POET, alongside TSEM, SOI, and WinSemi.
This is a textbook supply chain strategy, but applied to bleeding-edge physics. Instead of buying the multinational conglomerate that eventually sells the finished AI server, the author is targeting the highly specialized companies that the conglomerates are forced to rely on.
But let's break down why these specific niches matter. For example, testing. The notes single out AEHR for testing. Why is testing suddenly a primary investment thesis? Wasn't the industry already testing the copper chips?
Well, testing copper is relatively straightforward. You use microscopic physical probes to touch electrical contact pads on a chip and see if the current flows.
Right.
But when you transition to silicon photonics and co-packaged optics, you are no longer just testing electricity. You have to test the alignment of microscopic light beams.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you have to ensure a fragile glass fiber perfectly meets a silicon modulator at a sub-micron level. The complexity of testing optical components at mass manufacturing scale is a massive hurdle. The companies that hold the patents for doing that efficiently become indispensable.
It's the same logic for packaging, which the note's tied to the ticker POAT. The bottleneck isn't just inventing the laser, it's the physical nightmare of permanently gluing a fiber optic cable to a silicon chip so perfectly that the light doesn't scatter.
And doing it millions of times a day on an assembly line.
Precisely the argument. If the entire global ecosystem is shifting to this new standard of light, every single titan in the safe category has no choice but to rely on these specialized smaller companies to actually manufacture, assemble, and test the physical components.
And the analyst acknowledges that while broader macroeconomic conditions might cause short-term volatility in these specific trades, the underlying physical bottleneck demands a massive capital rotation toward the CPO and ELS supply chains.
Now, here's where the notes present a glaring contradiction that I find deeply, deeply fascinating.
Oh.
The analyst is modeling the total addressable market, the TAM, for these optical components, materials, and testing equipment, and the notes project the TAM will structurally expand by 3 to 5 times.
A 3x to 5x growth in market size.
Yes. But immediately after stating that massive projection, the author literally adds a caveat saying, I think this is sandbagging a bit.
The concept of an analyst openly admitting to sandbagging their own numbers is incredibly revealing about the psychology of financial forecasting.
Right. If an analyst puts a 15x growth projection in an official PDF, their Wall Street boss is probably going to ask them to take a random drug test. I mean, a 500% expansion is already an aggressive number to publish.
Very aggressive.
So why would an analyst whose entire reputation is built on predicting market size deliberately underestimate an industry's growth?
It comes down to the fundamental limitations of traditional financial modeling. Analysts are trained to rely on historical data to project future growth. They look at past sales cycles, apply a generous multiplier, and draw a linear trajectory upward.
Linear, yeah.
But when you are dealing with a truly transformative structural shift, moving from an electrical paradigm to an optical paradigm, linear modeling completely breaks down.
It can't account for the sudden release of pressure.
Exactly. The demand for AI compute right now is practically infinite. The only thing suppressing that demand, the only thing stopping companies from buying more chips is the gridlock. They can't network them fast enough.
So when you clear that up,
When you eliminate a massive bottleneck that has been suffocating an entire global industry, the resulting explosion in growth defies historical comparisons. Analysts sandbag, they manually pull their numbers down to a 3x or 5x multiplier because if they published what the physics actually implies when the gridlock clears, they would look irresponsible to traditional risk-averse investors.
it sounds like fantasy to anyone who doesn't understand the engineering. But the author of these notes, someone with a proven history of front-running the photonics and memory cycles, recognizes that structural shifts shatter the scales of normal projections.
The ceiling is vastly higher than the models want to admit.
Because the capital won't just trickle into these supply chains. It will flood them. The entire multi-trillion-dollar AI ecosystem is paralyzed until that optical high-speed rail line is built.
The logic laid out in the research is ruthless. You find the constraint, you find the companies holding the keys to the constraint, and you position yourself before the capital arrives.
So let's bring all these threads together. We started with the premise that the AI revolution isn't a gentle upward slope, but a violent sequence of overcoming bottlenecks.
A sequence dictated by the flow of data.
Yeah. We tracked the author's historical timeline, the desperate rush for compute and GPUs in 2023, the scramble to build memory and HBM in 2024, and now the definitive pivot to interconnects and networking for 2025 and beyond.
Right.
We explored the incredible physics behind solving this current gridlock, the forced migration from melting copper wires to co-packaged optics, using external laser sources to keep the heat away, and silicon photonics to paint the data onto beams of light.
And strategically, we reviewed the analyst's case for front-running the impending 2027 to 2028 commercialization window right now, examining the highly specialized supply chain components, the testing, the packaging, the lasers, rather than just parking capital in the diversified tech giants.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? Whether you are actively evaluating specific tickers like AEHR for testing or PUET for packaging, or whether you're simply trying to fundamentally understand where technology is heading, knowing this bottleneck sequence provides you with a map.
It's invaluable context.
It allows you to see the physical realities of the AI revolution long before the mainstream evening news catches on to the buzzwords. You understand the fundamental why and how behind the next massive shift in global infrastructure.
Knowledge is always most potent when it allows you to see the underlying patterns driving the daily noise. But building on the strict logic of this bottleneck resolution sequence, the sources leave us with a lingering question about the future.
Oh, where does the sequence point next?
Well, if we trust the timeline and the industry successfully solves this interconnect bottleneck by 2028, I mean, if the data is finally moving perfectly between the chips at the literal speed of light with zero gridlock,
Right.
what breaks next? The logic dictates something must fail. Does the next bottleneck move beyond the data processing entirely?
Wait, really? Like out of the data center?
Maybe. When the silicon brain is working flawlessly at light speed, perhaps the next wall we hit is the sheer physical limit of the body. The global power grids, the raw energy generation, and our fundamental ability to cool these massive, blazing hot optical cities.
If the brain works perfectly, the body gives out. That is a massive, fascinating problem to mull over as we watch this 2027 inflection point approach. Thank you so much for joining us on today's deep dive. We'll be back soon to unpack the next stack of research. Until then, keep looking for the bottlenecks.